God is such an amazing creator, but he's so good, his beauty is never monochromatic. He's able to create beauty across all different kinds of forms. I think of ports all over the world, whether it's a port in Seattle, Washington, or out in Africa or Europe or the Caribbean. They're beautiful in their own way. But there's no port that's quite as beautiful to anyone as their home port when they feel like they've finally arrived. As much as they might like to visit other locales, there's just something special about coming to the place that you call home. In the same way with people, God's beauty is so varied. He creates people with different shades and shapes and sizes. But in marriage, cherishing is all about learning to appreciate the particular spouse that God has given to you, understanding their beauty and letting them be your heart's home. Lisa and I were walking out of a rest home after we just visited a 98-year-old friend. There had been a huge Texas storm the night before, and so the car that Lisa had driven in, we'd come in two different cars, was partially in a puddle. And then somebody had put an oxygen stand right near it, so it was going to be tricky backing it out. As soon as we saw the situation, neither of us spoke. I just opened up my palm. Lisa dropped her keys. I backed her car out so she wouldn't have to get into the puddle or try to back the car around the oxygen stand. Again, this was an unspoken thing between us. We'd been married long enough, and I knew that Lisa would feel most cherished and most loved if I backed the car out for her so she didn't have to do it. I could imagine in other marriages, for instance, if I was married to a NASCAR driver or something, a wife might actually resent that, saying, "What are you talking about? And by the way, I'm going to beat you home." What's good advice for some marriages could be terrible advice for others. I was reading an article one time that had some great advice for probably 90% of the marriages. A couple in ministry that I'd been working with had sort of a different dynamic where the husband liked to talk about deep relational things and really explore those feelings. His wife grew up in a home where they didn't really talk like that. And if he would have pursued that article's advice, really trying to dig in and ask her how she's feeling, she might have felt shame. She might have felt embarrassment. She might have felt, I don't like this. This makes me uneasy. Why are you doing it? Cherishing our spouse is all about learning the particular. It's throwing away the stereotypes and saying, how do I cherish this unique person that God has made, who's become my wife, or for you wives, who's become my husband? In fact, in one sense, it calls us back to the glory of the Garden of Eden. Think about Adam and Eve and what was so unusual in their relationship. When Eve stood in front of Adam for the first time, he was looking at literally the only woman in the world. She defined to him what a woman is, what a woman looks like. He was astonished because she looked like him in the most important ways, but also so unlike him in even more important ways. There are those lips, eyes that seem curiously softer, legs like his, but somehow gloriously different, breasts, curves from shoulder to feet that to this day still make men sigh. What made this moment especially powerful, momentous, even enthralling for Adam? There was no Holly. There was no Shanice. There was no Sophia. There was just Eve. Adam couldn't compare Eve's back or legs, intelligence or wit to any other woman's. She was just Eve, the only woman in the world. Men, that's what it's like to cherish your wife, to view your wife that way, as the only woman in the world. You might say, how is that possible in a day when there are over 6 billion people on the planet and over 3 billion of them women? Well, I see how it's possible. As a pastor, I've stood next to a number of grooms as they watch their brides come up the aisle. And I always love to just look left when that bride is first seen and that woman is walking up. And I know to that young man, in that moment, there is no other woman in the world. He's not thinking of anything else. Nothing else is distracting him. There is just his bride coming up to give herself to him. And here's the thing. That doesn't have to be a once-in-a-lifetime reality. Cherish teaches us to treat our wives that way, as the only woman in the world. It starts out as a prayer. Lord, I want to look at my wife that way, as Eve. Then it's a choice, how we govern our minds, how we govern our hearts, and what we look at. It requires a commitment to be satisfied with our spouses. We'll have to choose again and again to do this. But eventually, it happens. We're so happy and we're so satisfied because we're married to the only woman who matters to us in that way. Song of Songs 6:9 captures this perfectly when the husband says to his wife, "My dove, my perfect one, is the only one." And that's what every wife wants to know, that in a special way, she feels like she is the only woman in the world to her husband. And women, you can have the same kind of experience and relationship with your husband, viewing him as Adam, the only man in the world. I know in some ways it might seem more difficult for women. In fact, statistics back that up. About 70% of divorces are pursued by the wife, not by the husband. But when you're committed to making your husband Adam the only man in the world, but that means once you choose him, you have to reset your parameter for contentment. You've chosen a man a certain way, and that's what you have to learn to be most satisfied in. No man can be strong in every area, and if we start to be compared to other men, even though we might do well in one area, we won't do so well in another. I think of a young couple where the young man was an extraordinary swimmer, so good that he was offered a scholarship at a prestigious school. But when his wife was still his girlfriend, she would occasionally comment about the body of a football player she would see or someone like that, and not in a mean way, just kind of offhanded. And she didn't realize what that did to her boyfriend, and so he would go into the gym and he would try to bulk up. The problem is swimmers don't want to have a football player's body, and it actually slowed him down as a swimmer. In the same way, the guy who wins the Tour de France will never be an offensive lineman in the National Football League. Your husband has certain strengths, and that means he's not going to have other certain strengths. And so when you start to view him as Adam, he's your particular man. He defines what a man is to you. You'll find yourself becoming more satisfied because he's all you've ever wanted him to be. Of course, comparison isn't always negative in that your spouse doesn't measure up. If you don't treat your husband as Adam, you might also miss some of his strengths. You'll start to tolerate his strengths and assume that that's just how every man is. My wife and I met a couple where the husband was a very accomplished man. He had actually been a professional athlete. He was a pastor of a large church. He'd succeeded throughout his entire life. He made a great living. And his wife had become so familiar with the husband who was a spiritual leader, who was a great athlete, who was a great provider, who everybody always cheered for, that she just assumed that's how husbands always operate. Until her husband finally told her one time, he goes, "It's been difficult because I feel like throughout my life with my mom, with cheerleaders, the coaches, and even the crowds, I've heard cheer, 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 cheer." He goes, "And sometimes I come home and all I hear is boo, boo, boo." And she realized that she really wasn't giving him the credit he was due because she thought all of his strengths are what men are supposed to be. She had let him set the bar of an acceptable man so high that instead of being so grateful that she was married to a successful man, she thought, well, he could still do a little bit better. The practice of treating your husband or wife like Adam and Eve, the only man or only woman in the world, can have a huge impact in the bedroom. There's a man who had a good bit of prior experience in the bedroom before he got married, but when he met his wife, they both became Christians, decided they wanted to do it God's way, and never slept together before they got married. But then about the first 10 years of their marriage, there was a lot of frustration about what was happening in the bedroom. His wife just wasn't enjoying it. They finally went to a counselor and he laid out his case about how he thought his wife was cold or even frigid. And his wife said, "I just don't enjoy it when this happens or that happens." And the husband protested to the counselor, "But women like that." And that's when the wise counselor said, "Not this woman. And she's the only one that counts." See, this man was treating his wife like a stereotype. When sex becomes a special experience, when you learn to cherish your spouse's body as a unique body, as a particular body, it goes to an entirely different level. Then it's not about just having your needs met or just about enjoying what's happening to you. It's actually an expression of the deepest kind of love. I cherish you, and expressing that physically. But guys, and women too, this also means keeping our heart for our spouse so that we can cherish them above all others. If I'm spending all my time looking at pictures of other ports, to go back to the opening image, imagine how great that port is in Africa or how wonderful the port is in Europe. Then when I get to my home port, I'm going to actually be a little bit disappointed because it doesn't live up to the fantasies of what I thought a port should be. The most satisfaction is found in the intimate relationship when we cherish our spouse's body just as God made them, and we share that experience together. In my book, Sacred Marriage, I share a prayer that I prayed about my wife when we first got married. I just said, Lord, let Lisa define beauty for me. God answered that prayer. And the wonderful thing about that prayer is that now my definition of a woman's beauty has aged with my wife. And I believe that leads to the most satisfaction in marriage. Because as my wife ages, my desire ages. And she is my Eve, the only woman in the world. In other contexts, treating our husband or wife like Adam and Eve means we have to recognize that we don't know how to cherish our particular spouse because we don't want to treat them like a stereotype. Even if you think you know what men want or you think you know what women want, that doesn't mean that's what your particular husband or wife wants. I remember being very surprised early on in my marriage when I found out that Lisa had what she called a Gary journal. And it was just like when she was in college taking notes, she was just trying to figure out, okay, this is what Gary likes or this is what sets him off. It was really her way of trying to study her husband. What is it that really helps him in this situation? So what if you were to take a step back in your marriage, to take it to the next level, to really cherish them as they really are, to start to study them and say, okay, this is what helps him when he's angry. This doesn't help so much. This is what she needs when she starts to tear up. This isn't what she needs. You know, maybe my sister was different or a former girlfriend was different. Here's what she's communicating to me when she's crying. Cherishing is built on that kind of particular focus. I've also found that it's really helpful to cherish my wife as Eve when I post some favorite pictures around her. There's just something about seeing her in those favorite poses that just touches my heart and renews my affection for her. You know, the whole science behind pornography is that it has to be new. You're literally training your brain to be excited by something you've never seen before. And so it always has to be a new image, a new video, a new picture, something like that. Well, I think if you can train your brain to only be fulfilled by something that's new and novel, which destroys marriage, we can also choose to train our brain to be ultimately and fully and completely satisfied by our spouse. It's amazing to me how some favorite pictures of my wife never grow old because it's not about a picture, it's not about an image, and it's not about a fantasy. It's about my Eve and all that represents and all that she is to me. And so I just love looking at those pictures. And if you don't have them, create them. Ask your spouse to take them. Put it in an important place next to where you work or where you get dressed in the morning so you're reminded about your particular spouse. It also reminds us that we can keep pursuing our spouse because they're always changing, and that's what makes them so unique. Getting married will change a woman. It'll change a man. Having children or not being able to have children will change a woman. It will change a man. Seeing your parents die, succeeding in business, failing in business, going through depression, all of those stations in life, all that we go through, it changes who we become. And so we never really fully know our spouse because they're always becoming a different person. And what I like about this is that then my pursuit to cherish my wife keeps that curiosity alive. And when you think about it, it was that curiosity that was the spark for dating. It was intoxicating, getting to know somebody and they're saying, tell me more. What did you do then? Or tell me about what it was like for you this, or what do you think about that? And when we cherish in marriage, we recreate that same spark because we want to recognize who they are, the particular person they are. So we maintain our curiosity, to get to know them as they change. And it's so healing when we do this. So if we want to start to put all of this together, one of the ways we can do it is this. Revisit the most common misunderstandings in your marriage. Have you been treating your husband or wife like a stereotype? Have you been saying, well, this is what a wife is supposed to do, or this is how a husband is supposed to act? Are you cherishing them for how they really are? Are you figuring out, this is what this means to my husband, or this is what this means to my wife? The whole goal here of the cherishing marriage and treating our spouse as the unique person they are is to get back to that Garden of Eden marriage. Now, often when people think of that Garden of Eden marriage, they're usually thinking about the sexual relationship, but it's so much deeper than that. When I think about the Garden of Eden, I think about Adam and Eve, the only man and the only woman in the world. That's marriage at its highest and its best. I was asked to speak to a small group of young people whose hearts were broken when two of their friends had an affair with each other. And they're at that stage of marriage where they're really saying, is there hope for us? Are we foolish for thinking that we can be different? And when I spoke to them and prayed about what I could share, I said some of the normal things, that the best defense is a good offense. You build a cherishing marriage and then you're not so vulnerable to any other type of relationship. But here's the thing where I was able to be even stronger when I talked to them. I said, not only can you have hope, I believe you can have confidence that if you do what we said in the first sessions here and what we'll talk about in the next, that if you'll choose to cherish your spouse, if you'll shape your heart, if you'll train your mind to cherish, you'll never want to stray. I put it this way. They say, how can you say you're never going to have an affair? Well, just a few weeks before, I had preached a sermon on the supremacy of Christ. And I can guarantee you, I will never preach a sermon on the supremacy of Confucius or the supremacy of Buddha or any other religious figure. Because every day I shape my heart toward Christ. I'm in His scriptures. I see the brilliance of His words. I worship what He's done. And I can have a great degree of confidence that I am never going to change my God. And I believe I can have the same degree of confidence that I'm never going to want to change my spouse. Why? Because every day I look at her as Eve, the only woman in the world, and she is supreme in my heart. And you might say, well, Gary, I get that about Christ because He's so demonstrably superior to everyone else. We live in a world with billions of people. What if another woman is smarter than my wife? Or what if another husband really is kinder than mine? Well, here's the thing. They can still be supreme in your heart. For a good bit of my life, I lived very close to Canada. In fact, I did my master's work in Canada up in Vancouver at Regent College. And one of my children went 4 years of college in Canada. And so we've always enjoyed Canada. And it's always funny when we lived by the border and we didn't have enough money for cable TV, we would use the antenna and we get all the Canadian stations. And so when you watch the Olympics from a Canadian station, you get to watch the person who's going to finish 19th or 13th or 7th. But you still got the Canadians saying, we're number one, because saying we're number 5 or we're number 6, even though that's pretty good, it's still not quite the same thing. But here's the thing, Canada is still number 1 in their hearts. They're never going to beat the United States overall in medal count. They're never going to beat Russia. They're not likely to beat Germany. But the Canadians can still keep Canada supreme in their heart because it has their affection. And that's what we can do for our spouse. We can shape our heart for them every day. I can recognize other women have great giftings, that some women could be extraordinarily beautiful, some could be tremendous athletes, some can be so godly and pray such powerful prayers or just have incredible intellects. But every other woman has one fatal flaw in this sense. She's not Lisa, and Lisa has my heart. Lisa's my home. She's my port that I think about, that I can't wait to return to. Guys, your wife doesn't have to look like a swimsuit model. have the energy of a presidential candidate, the business savvy of Oprah, or the intellect of a college professor. As long as you cherish her like she's your Eve, the only woman in the world, you'll be supremely satisfied. She wins because she's cherished like she wants to be, without having to measure up to anyone else. And you win because you're married to your favorite woman in the world. Women, your husband doesn't have to look like a lifeguard, be a billionaire with a private plane, possess the romantic banter of a leading man, or have the creativity of a musician. He just has to be your Adam, the only man in the world. The goal of a cherishing marriage always comes back to Song of Songs, chapter 6, verse 9. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one. When I'm with my wife, when I'm with my Eve, when I'm with my dove, I'm at the place I want to be, a cherishing marriage with the woman I cherish above all others.